Well, on Rebuilders today, we are in a bit of a different setting.
We are in the lovely St. Colum's in Hawthorne, Melbourne, and we are interviewing Al Gordon from Saint in London. But also we have a studio audience with us. You can hear them now.
It's a really fun episode we look forward to sharing with you. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Lydia and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both?
I'm excellent. How are you, Daniel?
I am sprightly on this evening. It's recording.
And this is not just any evening. It's not just us in the studio, that we actually have some other people with us. Would you like to say hello, room? Rebuilders Live.
Yes. It feels a little bit different recording an episode with a whole bunch of people listening.
And where are we, Liddy?
We are in a beautiful church in Hawthorne, Melbourne, St. Colum's. And just a shout out to Mark and his team for having us here. Thank you so much. What a beautiful building to be hosting this live event in.
Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, how are we going to kick off this episode? You've got pastries over there, Daniel, so I feel like that's a
for everyone
pretty
listening, we just
instant
did a
segue.
giveaway of pastries, or a couple giveaways. And
Yes.
I took one of them.
Where were the pastries from?
Our first non-official sponsor, Double Dutch Bakery in Melbourne, provided some special pastries.
Yes.
In Kensington.
Thank you. In Kensington, check it out.
Yeah.
I've got an almond croissant here, which I'll be gradually consuming as the episode goes.
Excellent. We'll check in with updates along
please.
the way.
Check in along the way.
Speaking of updates, one of the stories of our podcast has also been our encounters with various animals.
Yes.
And
yes.
regular listeners will realise that of late we have been dealing with a fox that is under our office.
We haven't been sure that it was a fox.
Well, there was a debate
fox.
last time, and I just wanted
Could have
to
been
mark.
a cat.
I said it was a fox.
There was video footage of it, but we weren't convinced that was what was going under the building.
Because there were other animals that were lurking in the same area.
Which we never saw on
Anyway.
video, and we saw a fox on video near the hole.
We saw a cat.
Oh,
Definitely saw
okay.
a cat on the video. So anyway, here you go. All of the facts. Yesterday? Was it yesterday?
Yes.
The fox emerged in daylight from under the building.
And it was huge.
Wolf size?
Wolf.
Well,
Hyena.
so anyway, we can confirm that it's a fox. So that puts that to bed. That puts that to rest. And now we can move on.
Well, it still
Well, it doesn't put it to rest. It's still around. It's like, it needs to be dealt with.
We will put it to rest.
I'm imagining, some kind of, Fantastic Mr. Fox
Send off.
version 2.
Send off.
The sequel.
I'm from the country.
Yeah, Daniel did work. For those who don't know, Daniel did work on a large station in the middle of Australia, and may have had to dispatch with animals. But this
were
is
no
the
foxes
city.
there.
You cannot do it. Here. Yes.
That's a side podcast.
Yes.
All right. Well, let's get into the episode, and we're going to do that by inviting our very special guest, Al Gordon, to come and join us in the chair.
Please give him a round of applause. Yes. So good to have you with us, Al. For those who don't know, Al is the lead of Saint Church in London. He's also the founder of the Renaissance movement, and we're super excited to have you here in Melbourne and on Rebuilders.
Oh, what a treat. Thank you so much for your welcome. I feel so honored. This is like my favorite podcast. So being here is a little bit of, I was saying to Mark and Lydia earlier, it feels like when Alice falls down the rabbit hole. I feel like I'm in Wonderland. So thank you so much for having me. Really honored to be here. Thank you.
And how long have you been leading Saint?
Well, we probably need to define terms because I don't feel like I lead much of Saint, but I've been watching what God's been doing there. We planted in 2016 and it's been amazing. Pandemic and all that stuff. So we've done it completely the wrong way around, but are learning as we go. And it's been wonderful seeing what God's done and just, it's a sort of one by one, the stories people's lives impacted that really make it kind of count. Yeah.
And one of the reasons you're here in Oz is for Renaissance. And
That's
we're
right.
going to dig into Renaissance in more detail later on in the podcast. But perhaps just give us a little intro of what Renaissance movement is.
Well, we are, I guess, passionate about seeing the church equipped as people who can understand what it means to live made in the image of a creator in a world where increasingly what it is to be human is to be defined by that relationship with the creator. So we talk about three things: encountering the creator, equipping the creative, and empowering every church to become a cathedral of creativity. And that's really our heart, is that we'd see in the age of the algorithm, the human race really discover their creative potential. And the role the church has to play in that is really key. So we're helping encourage that. We're trying to play our part in that. So we're gathering actually for the first ever Renaissance conference in Australia, happening in Brisbane. Probably will happen by the time this is out, but it will hopefully have been an amazing time. And just excited for the adventure.
Yeah. And home, northeast, London.
East, sort of northeasty, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you're going to get there if you go north, but you'll be better off going straight east. So come and visit.
Yes.
If you're in London,
Yes.
head east, sort of northeast. We're there. Hackney is where we're based, and the church is like across East London now. But it's a wild journey. East London is so much fun. You got to come and hang out. You got to come and hang out. When are you guys going to come and hang out?
We'll
do a return match.
Yeah, Rebuilders Live.
Let's do it.
Yeah. In London.
Live in London.
And the last time you were in Melbourne, if it serves me right, was 30 years ago.
That makes me feel so old. I was a teenager, and I met my wife traveling around Australia, fell in love, not in Australia, because we met in a backpackers bar and we just kind of exchanged phone numbers. And then we were at university together. Years later, we fell in love. But our first meeting was in Australia. So I owe you guys a huge debt of gratitude. In fact, my wife, my family are here tonight. So we're just so grateful to the whole Australian nation for setting us up.
Yes.
So thank you.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, we're really excited about what we're going to be digging into and the conversation that we're going to have.
We are. So we're going to start where we often start with this podcast. We do talk about a number of different things, but a regular topic is renewal, looking at what it looks like for God to outpour his spirit on his church and awaken us in this time. So we have talked about for many years, many months, about spot fires happening across the world. And we'd love to hear from you what your experience is of these spot fires, of the spirit showing up and doing amazing things in people's lives and awakening the church.
Well, thank you. It's a really great way to think of it. I've been listening in and love that definition that there are little spot fires, moments where the Spirit of God seems to be doing something new and it's bursting out. And I think, like you'll know with fires, the conditions that are essential are like dryness. So it's not necessarily the riverbeds, where they're full of water. It's the real dry places. So we're probably just the dry place. I think in my story, and we've talked about this, you mentioned Asbury earlier. I had the privilege to be there with some friends during the outpouring. And I think, having been a Christian for a while, I'm not like a Holy Spirit tourist, but I'm keeping my eyes on the horizon for signs that the smoke might be rising, that God might be doing a new thing. And I think off the back of that, we experienced a sense of the outpouring of God's presence, and it just sort of ruined me. I try not to kind of well up when I talk about it. It still moves me just watching the inbreaking of the presence of God among a group of young people. And I think for me, it felt like a sort of a window in on an operating system change that's coming from much of the church, where we're a bit done with like performance and hype, and we just want the presence of God. We want the real thing. We want Jesus to walk in the room when we gather. And God is kind and God is sovereign as well. It's not up to anything we can do. But the only thing we have is our dryness, our emptiness. And so we've just seen in London in the last 18 months, just wonderful signs of God moving. I think the lower we go, the more we realize it's not going to be us that crafts anything, or engineers. If we bring our hunger to God, God is always faithful and shows up. So we could talk all night about stories we've seen, but we were exchanging, Mark and I were connecting, and we were chatting a few months back, just exchanging notes. Like, it feels like God's doing something new. And I'd say a few things. One is like the hunger, a sense, secondly, of holiness, that God is restoring to the church a desire for like, hey, we've got to live in a way that reflects the beauty of God. And that's not condemnation, it's conviction, it's freedom. say with that comes a kind of humbling that's going on, because you realize that, as pastors, like, we've not got it all right, that we all need to walk on our knees. So the lower we go, the more we're seeing the presence of God move and just lives being impacted. What I've been struck by is like the hope we're seeing with our young people. I can tell you a story. I was talking to you earlier about some of the stories we've seen, just remembering people's lives getting impacted and starting to see the impact in the church, in those who are coming to faith, but also outside of the church now, like deep impact.
So I'd love to. I remember, we've chatted about your experience at going, to Wilmore, which is where Asbury is. I was there a few weeks ago. It really is in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Like it's a very small town. And I remember you sharing about your experience of getting there and then sort of getting out of the car and then almost feeling something before you got out of the car.
Yeah.
I'd love to, our listeners to hear that story.
Well, being British, I'm a natural cynic. I have the sort of spiritual gift of cynicism. And I get out the hire car, shut the door, and I was kind of expecting like a great Christian gathering, like a kind of church festival or conference or like a hyped up thing. And you could see this town was just like something was going on. There was like queues all around the block. They shut the town. I mean, you couldn't get there. You had to kind of weave your way through the streets to get there. They think 100,000 people would have packed into that space over those days. But I remember getting in the parking lot, shut the door, and we couldn't actually see the auditorium where the chapel where people were gathering. But he shut the door, and I remember turning to my friend Steve and saying, oh, you could literally feel the presence of God. And it wasn't like Disneyland excitement. It was actually what struck me was the love of God, the power and presence of God, and in a way, the holiness of God are all wrapped up together. So when you talk about revival and awakening and the presence of God, what we're actually meaning is like Isaiah drawing near to the King of Kings and the Holy of Holies going, and I felt that in the car park. I turned to my friend Steve, I was like, we can't go in there yet. We've got to get right. So we felt this like Psalm 24. You've probably heard this quoted many times in this context. Who can ascend the hill of the Lord? Those with clean hands and pure hearts. That's a generation who's going to seek your face. And we found ourselves like thinking, we really have to get right. And I'm a professional Christian. I have probably more sins than most people. We're pride-filled pastors, most of us. And so actually understanding that I need to really get low and call out to God. And so that was part of that journey. When I got in there, I was kind of quite underwhelmed. I was like, it feels just like church. And that's what's beautiful about what God seems to be doing, is it's not overwhelming. We live in a generation that feels it's been so overwhelmed. You open up your phone, it's a stream of content. What Jesus does is he comes close, like gently, to the brokenhearted, and that's my overwhelming memory from that time, is the presence of God, the power of God, the holiness of God, and people getting free because Jesus was really close to them and loving them. And that, has marked us. And I think it's marked our church since then.
And in a sense, God sort of burst something almost down the front there in this hall in Hughes Auditorium in Kentucky that really has then, God's used to spark something in London.
Yeah. Well, gosh, so many things. Like we have, I remember getting back on the plane and flying back over from the US to the UK, and it's like a 12-hour flight, and I remember sitting there weeping at the back of the plane with my friend Steve. We were at the two seats nearest the toilets in the kitchen, and the air stewardess, who were on American Airlines, they're so nice, they kept coming over and giving us tissues and pretzels because they thought I'd had some kind of breakup with Steve, that we'd had a falling out. And so they kept coming over saying, you okay, honey, and have another Diet Coke or whatever. And I felt this grief of like, I don't ever want to go back to church where Jesus isn't. And I run church, sometimes I think, well, we're just running a program here. I want the presence of God. I need the presence of God in my life. And I was sort of grieving, and I felt the Lord say two things. Number one, prepare the way for revival. Go back and get ready. You got, a year, 18 months. Go get ready for what I'm going to do. And that woke me up. I was like, okay, well, this is not a drill. We've got to go and get ready because God's going to move. And so I started making a list. I was like getting my notes app out. I was like, right, we're going to have like, a cajon, because they had a cajon on the stage at the outpouring. I was like, we're not going to have any words on the screens. We're going to have kids down the front leading worship. It's going to be great. And I was making this list of practical things like kill planning center. It's clearly demonic. Like, let's get rid of all these things. And the Lord then said to me, second thing, and I can remember it to this moment. He said, Al, change nothing but your heart. Like change nothing. I was like, that's the hard one, right? So go back to London, and we've just seen God begin to move really gently and powerfully. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like the first Sunday I stood up to preach, having got back, before I'd actually got up to preach, the worship, we'd lost control of the room. God had just swept in and began to it wasn't anything ostentatious or no kind of, like big signs and wonders, just a sense that people were just like, we're meeting with God. And so like there's momentum in the room that feels supernatural. And then preaching that day, I remember doing a kind of terrible talk that first Sunday of like what I'd seen and calling people to repentance. And we saw more people come to faith in that Sunday than we had in 7 years. Like people fell into the kingdom that Sunday. And in the weeks after, we've just seen story after story of when people hear that Jesus is here and among you, they are running into the kingdom. And that's been amazing. Then we've just learned to pray. I mean, I know you guys are involved in 24/7, and just like we're really bad at praying. Like if you did an audit of churches around prayer, Saint would be like not one of our spiritual strengths. And but we just found this like passion and desire to learn to pray. And that's been crazy. I mean, we can talk more about that, but like that's a new thing. So the fruit has been amazing, not in a kind of like you can't look on the surface and see it, being deep down. It feels like God's preparing us as he has been with you guys. So I'd love to like throw the question back at you, Mark, and tell us a little bit about like what you guys have been seeing, because I know we were comparing notes on Zoom the other day of like God seeming to move in these gentle ways among us. But share what you guys have been seeing.
Yeah. I mean, it's been fascinating to have this podcast because, there's obviously what we've experienced at Red, and we can share some of that, but it really became, as we began to sort of track what was happening and God was doing around the place, people began to email in. Right. And, we didn't talk about all of this on the podcast. But what really struck me is, I don't know, there's something in our minds that if God's going to do something big, it's going to be at one of the places that we think of as big, the big mega church, that big conference or something like that. And it's just been really humbling to just people sending in emails and messages where God's really moving in out-of-the-way places, rural churches, small churches, different denominations, but there seems to be a commonality, like even that example you gave of almost before getting to the sermon, where, we've experienced that a couple times at Red. And when we had David Thomas come out and do a tour of Australia, it just was really palpable that something was different. I'm trying to put my finger on this, and even when I was in the US just last month, I visited churches that I knew well. And it's almost like in the worship, you go, hang on, there's something different here. You want to look around and you're like, it's a deeper hunger. It's a more honest, cry out to God. Is it all the time? No. Is it everywhere? No. But there just seems to be a different register where, I don't know, which still, a lot of this podcast is us trying to work it out. But just this sense that something has changed. And something's changed sort of in the last 18 months, but I think even more so in the last sort of, 9 months or something. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Liddy and Daniel.
Yeah, I think just touching on that, I've had the privilege to be able to chat with a bunch of different pastors and people from around the world who listen to the podcast and write in. And just, I think something you kind of mentioned there, I think really, I think I've found a real common thread of people getting to the end of themselves and that sense of dryness and kind of lostness, but a real hunger, like there's got to be something more here. Like I'm not throwing out faith here. I'm not throwing in the towel, but there's got to be something more. And it seems to be that kind of coming to the end of themselves, experiencing that personally and corporately, that kind of, but then hearing the stories, oh, hang on, there's something happening over there. What if I lent in a new way? What if I sacrificed some things, like really sought the Lord in a simple and new way? And through that, just beginning to be really surprised by the way the Spirit begins to move, what begins to happen in their own hearts, what they begin to experience amongst other people as well. So I think that, there's a real common thread that I've noticed chatting with lots of different people there.
I don't think I've got anything to add in addition to that. But I wonder if it's helpful to kind of move on to this next question or this next part of the conversation. We're talking about renewal. We're seeing spot fires happening. There is there is something happening, but what does it look like to sustain that? Not to just sort of have this sort of big event and have an experience and then go home and everything goes away. What does it look like to, steward it and sustain it and seek God continually to actually see renewal occur over time in a culture and in a place? What do you see?
Well, it's interesting. We've had this conversation, I think, a couple of times, that if you look at the history of awakening, revival is fun, but it's not the end game. The end game is, the transformation of society. The poor would be fed. That the people who don't know Jesus would experience Him. And for that to happen, if you look at the history of renewal, there is a sort of a long-termism that we need to develop, like a muscle that's a marathon, not a sprint. And there are moments when you're bursting full of energy and God seems to break the ceiling open and it's like, wow. And there are moments when it's like, it's just business as usual. I'm encouraged by the stories. I was reading again this year of the account of the Hebridean revival. When I sort of, we kind of romanticize these revivals as the building shook, people dropping to their knees in the fields, but quite a lot of the Sundays and the midweeks for years in the middle of it all were quite boring. And they preached the word faithfully in season out of season. And if you look at the history of it, it charts like 1 year, something amazing happened. Nothing happens for 2 or 3 years. The next year, the barn shook, a youth meeting happened. Nothing happens for 2 or 3 years. But it seems to be there was a paradigm shift in the leaders there and in the kind of people that they were expectant for God to move in a generational way. And in our culture, we've been so short term. We're not helped by our sort of social media cycles. We just think, and the political sides are the same. We could talk about that another day. But we're all thinking about the next 3 or 4 year plan. Most things in life fail because you don't think about the 30 or 40-year plan and then respond to the 90-day plan. If we've stewarded our churches for outpouring and awakening with that 30-year vision, what would we do in the 90 days ahead of us right now? So we'd probably pray more. We'd probably love the poor. We'd probably make more space for people who don't go to church to come. We'd do things like we run Alpha 3 times a year. It's amazing. Like we're ready. And I always... I'm encouraged by my Aussie friends because you're so good at this. Like when you're surfing, you don't start paddling when the wave is on you.
And we all surf.
And you all surf.
Yeah.
Like just to give
in Melbourne.
a massive cultural stereotype. But you start paddling when you see the set on the horizon. That's when you start getting ready. So I think we want to learn to live like, I want to be having this conversation in 40 years time when we're all sort of, much older than we are now. Well, 40 years older than we are now. Thinking, what does it begin to look like when awakening is happening? Because I think it's a long-term game. But what do you feel, Mark?
I'm fascinated too in your thoughts as well. I mean, we've been talking about this where, when you talk about awakening and outpouring and revival, the words you want to use, it can become quite event-driven. Yeah. And so, I was talking to Judy, my wife, the other day, and, we just realized it's almost easier to put on an event than to actually push into renewal, particularly in a church environment. And one thing we've been thinking about too is, what does this look like week in, week out in a church? And how do you steward it? And I think we began to realize too, as God was moving at Red and when, we had, again, David Thomas was with us, he sort of said, something's happening here. How do you steward it? And it went from like something that's very far on the horizon, like a dot, like what if the Holy Spirit is moving amongst us at the moment? And how do you steward that and build deeper now? Because in a sense, it's easier to have the big event, do the conference, do it, and boom, you move on. But I think living it day by day, week by week is a lot different. I know you guys have had a sort of regular rhythm that in a sense was birthed, where you guys have been praying with some other churches and worshiping. Yeah, I'd love our listeners to hear that story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the outpouring, I found myself in the front on my knees praying for London with my friend and co-pastor Pete Hughes, who leads a similar church to Saint called KXC, amazing church. And KXC and Saint will be two kind of quite large churches in the similar part of London, probably similar demographics, quite young, average age in their 20s. And, we always sort of say iron sharpens iron among churches. What we kind of mean is like we'd look over each other's shoulders and slightly with competition, be like, if they were doing the 10 Commandments as a series, I'd think, well, let's do the 11 Commandments. Just to kind of like, and we love each other, but in a kind of professional way. And down the front of the outpouring, we're on our faces in the presence of God, repenting of everything we could think of, just, under the waterfall. And I remember Pete putting his arm around me and beginning to pray. And he's like, Lord, send revival to London. And I'm like, yes, Lord. Thinking, yes, send it. And Pete says, but don't start with my church, start with Al's church, Saint. And I was like, that's a big prayer to pray, when you're close to God, like that heart. And so, of course, I have a beat, and then I'm like, and of course, send it to KXC first, Lord, just in case, But something in me broke that day around that competition, that kind of striving and that drivenness. And I left different because Pete had been so generous in his prayers. And we then got together, we got back to London, unpacked my suitcase. And the first phone call I made was actually to Pete. I said, Pete, look, I just feel that we should get our churches together and pray. And we're not big praying churches. We did Kingdom Come nights, or, there would be 30 people in the room. And it felt really depressing. In fact, the last one we'd done, I was like, we're going to stop doing this because it's I don't want to be here. And I'm the senior pastor. So I said to Pete, look, why don't we just call our churches to pray? Joel talks about a solemn assembly. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool? And Pete was the same. We thought, well, let's just get our churches. So we came together with another church called Imprint. So Wale, Pete, and I, we get our 3 churches together, and we called it at super short notice on a Monday night, the worst night to come out in London. And a few days' notice, we announced on the Sunday, the next day. And we expected maybe 100 to come. And we opened the doors at 7 p.m. and there was a queue literally all the way down the street as far as you could see. Hundreds and hundreds of people, literally, over 500-600 people gathering in that night. And the atmosphere in the room is really hard to describe because it was utterly unhyped, but there was this deep sense of collaboration, communion, unity. And it says in Psalm 133, to paraphrase, when brothers and sisters dwell in unity, God commands blessing. There's something about unity and humility and preferring one another, even at a senior church leader level, that breaks the spiritual stronghold over a city and releases God's blessing. So I feel like we're in this pre-season where we're warming up. It's I don't know if you do this with Aussie rules football. I'm straying into a different cultural narrative here, but we do this with rugby. You do pre-season training. This is a pre-season training for the church and revival. What do the drills look like? Well, one is unity. Another is prayer. The other is repentance and humility between leaders and learning to repair those bridges and say sorry. And even if you never reached out, if you're listening to your pastor in your city, reach out to another pastor and say, hey, listen, the wave may be coming. We're going to need each other. You're a good teacher. I want to learn from you. We've got a great building. I want to learn from you. And so we've just seen in that prayer gathering, we call it a joint prayer gathering, over the sort of last 18 months, it's built and built and built to the point where we gather 1,000 young people praying through the night. You'd never have heard of that before in London. In our generation, young leaders, people coming from all over the UK now to pray. And these rooms have been wild, totally unhyped. You're never sure who's leading. We put the band in the middle, no chairs, but we've seen crazy things begin to happen. I'll think of one story and then I'll stop. But there's a young lady called Gina who, she's given me permission to share the story. Didn't grow up with a faith. To paraphrase and summarize, she had a very serious medical condition. Tumors in her spine, very bad cancer, had left her unable to walk, unaided, so she had a wheelchair and sticks. She's in her mid-20s, is a scientist, does a PhD, and is one of the leading brains working on the pandemic response. But during the midst of that, is very, very unwell, gets to the lowest point where she can't get out of bed anymore. She's confined to a wheelchair. Her spine is completely eroded. And medically speaking, she's never going to walk again. She's in utter agony every day. And meanwhile is the person who's fixing the kind of government response and is one of the top scientists and works for the top scientist in the UK in this area. Anyway, she has no faith. One day she cries out to God in the midst of the darkest moment during lockdown and begins a journey of faith, ends up at Saint, comes on Alpha, gets kind of stuck in and ends up coming to one of these joint prayer gatherings just this Easter, so early this year. And she says, I'm just going to come for an hour. She'd heard us talk about it at church. She comes in with her sticks, sits at the back, thinks only lasts an hour, I'm in such pain. We did an altar call. We said, if anyone would like prayer and, encourage you whenever there's an altar call, go get prayer. You never know what God's going to do. So she comes forward and says, I just love prayer for more of the Holy Spirit, not expecting anything else. But the presence of God is in the room. There's a principle. When Jesus is in the room, the power of God is present to heal. So you don't need to necessarily even ask him. It's just God sometimes does this. Now, we can talk about this for days. He doesn't always heal. It's a mystery. Gina is so articulate on this. She's so thought through. She said, I don't know what happened. But in that prayer time, she's prayed for by these 2 guys down the front. And she goes back to her seat and sits down. She goes, hang on a minute, I can't find my walking sticks. What's going on? And she panics because she can't move without them. And so she's walking around the room looking for walking sticks. She realizes, I'm walking around the room looking for my walking sticks. What's going on? So she comes up to me and she says, Al, I don't mean to alarm you, but I'm Gina. I'm a scientist. I wouldn't do this unless I thought there was some evidence. I do believe God has begun to heal me. So she goes home that night. The next day she gets out of bed totally pain-free, comes and finds me the next Sunday and says, I've not got any more pain. I'm walking. I said to her, go check it out with your doctor. Go see the hospital. She goes to the hospital. The doctor, they give her a scan. Her physio comes and sees her, and they're all completely baffled. They said, you've grown 1.5 inches. Your spine is no longer collapsed. And it seems to be something medically unexplainable has happened. So she goes to work where her boss is the lead scientist in this area. Over the Easter break, they had shut the office to close and refurbish the department she works in to make it accessible for her. They built a ramp, a lift, and toilets. She walks in after a little break and she goes, hi guys, it's me. I've got some news. Walks in. They're like, Gina, what is going on? And she said to me, every time she shares her story, she gives a little advert. She says, I've got an electric wheelchair that cost me over £1,000, recently bought, sitting in my hallway. If anyone would like it, it's gathering dust. I haven't used it since then. But that's just one little story. And that's not anyone seeking healing. It's not, it's a mystery when God moves like that. But what I'm learning is that if we prioritize the presence of God, the kingdom of God begins to break out without us even thinking about it. And there's a generation like Gina who are longing to know, is it safe for me to come? If I come, is it going to be weird? But when they meet Jesus there, it's like, oh, this is not only safe and not weird, but also it's the presence of God changes us from the inside out.
You also had David Thomas and some other young people from around Europe come and pray at your church. And at the end of that week of prayer and meeting with God and crying out for God to move, the Times of London had a really interesting column by James Marriott, which mentioned your church. I'd love you just to mention that sort of little detail, because we read that, and I remember reading that going, I read that article, it was really interesting about London becoming more religious. And then at the end, I'm like, hang on, that's Al's church. Yeah. Do you want to just share that?
Well, it's crazy. I mean, gosh. It was news to me too. So this article was about how young people are turning back to God. How it was sort of, millennials, Gen Z are finding faith. And it is culturally true. Statistically, there is an uptick, a turn in the cultural mood among young people who I think are just done with, the stuff that has been sold to them, and they want more. They want that hunger is becoming a kind of search spiritually. But I think, interestingly, this is a very good journalist. He lives locally to us and walks past the church every day. And he had this great phrase at the end. He said he wandered in one Sunday morning expecting the building to be closed, as you would do. It's a big historic building, and he'd walked past it for years, and I think probably it had been closed for much of that time. And he walked in there and he said that the place was completely packed out and people were worshiping, and I don't know which service he came to, but he was really moved by it. And I think he said this phrase, he said, I'd come expecting to see a kind of ghost of the past, and instead I saw a vision of the future. And I think it's worth noting that the water table is rising, and people are starting to notice, whether it's young people turning up to pray in the middle of the night, or people gathering like we are tonight, in Melbourne, to ask, how can we see renewal in our day? There seems to be this salt that is on our tongues and our lips right now, that we're hungering and thirsting for more of God, and people are beginning to notice. Everywhere you look, people are starting to say, well, there must be more to life than this. How can we experience this? All that. But what do you think's going on?
In a sense, we're just marking it. But, it's really remarkable to be, I was in Portland, Oregon, a few weeks ago, and hearing the stories there of people sort of walking off the street with really, completely sort of not in church type people, and just with crazy spiritual stories. People coming in, and just in New Zealand, and hearing stories, and people in the New Age movement, hippie movement, coming to faith in radical ways. We're having conversations with people here. It's just an uptick that you can't sort of write off as just a couple of anecdotes, hearing it in so many different places. And it's just like something's flipped. Someone said to me the other night, they said, it was fashionable to not believe in God a little while ago, but something's changed with younger people. And I think the church is almost catching up with it a little bit. Like, it's almost like on the street. And is it everyone? No. Is it everywhere? No. But something is definitely happening. And I just think the sort of nihilism of the culture has really just gone beyond with some people. And, I think often will read the culture. If you're a bit older, you're used to reading the culture through in Melbourne here. It's what the Age newspaper column thinks, or it's what's in the ABC News or on The Project on Channel 10. These are the cultural markers. But if you actually look at the readership or the viewership of these things, it's a bubble. And then you get online and you look at what people talking UFOs and psychics, and there is this massive spiritual renaissance happening that's only growing, but it's almost happening in sort of an underground sense, but it's really, really big. And so, I think that there is this significant cultural shift happening at this moment, and a little bit, there's the myth of disenchantment, that the West was disenchanted. I don't think it's exactly true. I think it just pushes down these beliefs and then they come up again, and people are seeking God. So it's a really interesting time, we're sensing.
I think just something that you mentioned there, Mark, about us as the church kind of needing to be surprised that people are returning to God, and that we need to be shaken out of our this expectation that nobody's interested and then we're going to fade into decline. Mm-hmm. That's not the story, and God is changing that story, and he's opening our imagination to something new, which I think is very much the story of creativity, right?
Yeah.
It is the story of newness, of the Spirit doing something new in us. So I wonder if it's worth starting to talk about that.
Mm. And I just on that quickly too, I noticed too, as I was hearing the stories of people, asking about faith, really unexpected people, a lot of the Christians who were telling me were almost sharing of their surprise. So it wasn't like, hey, I'm a great evangelist, then I started a gospel presentation on a bus. It's more people being shocked as their mates are asking them, or their friends turning up, and almost a bit like, oh, wow, I didn't expect this. It's almost like not evangelism, it's just seekers grabbing Christians and going, tell me more,
Yeah.
And I think it was interesting. I don't know if you saw it. There was Tom Holland, the historian, said the other day. He said that I think it was an interview. I can't remember who it was with, but he said that the church, a lot of what the church has done throughout history of creating hospitals and institutions and schools, the state does a lot of that now, or private enterprise does a lot. And he said the one thing that Christians have got going for them is that the weird stuff.
Yes.
He said, the spiritual stuff. And that's also what a lot of denomination churches are trying to push away from, because they think it's repellent. But society is big into weird. Like people want to talk about stuff. They want to talk about ghosts. They want to talk about, as I said, UAPs. It's just fascinating to have this realization that the culture has changed. And I like that. You don't have to necessarily be super weird ourselves, but the supernatural
But we're
stuff,
working on it.
Yeah, exactly. And some of us are naturally gifted. But I think that's a paradigm shift for the church. Because I think, for decades it's been, let's not talk about the weird stuff or be too weird because it's going to scare people off. No, people are drawn to it.
I mean, I sense that in myself. I'm like, I've got to break out of this belief or expectation that people are going to think that this is weird and wacky. And I guess in some notion it is, but it's also life-giving and the truth.
And maybe the church had to become so weak and dependent that we're really pleased to see new people. Yes. We had a guy turn up. I baptized a guy last weekend, or 10 days ago, called Freddie. Crazy story. During lockdown, breaks up with his girlfriend. They'd lost a baby, tragic, depressed, locked in his own room, young guy, early 20s. Totally at the end of his life and wanted to end his life. So he decided to get his bicycle. He says, the only thing I owned was a bicycle. He rode it to the edge of the motorway in East London and stood on the hard shoulder in the night waiting to cycle out into the traffic, and the traffic was coming. And as he steps on the pedals, he feels this physical force reach out and just pulls him back 3 meters into the air, onto the hard shoulder, and literally blows him back like a giant, hand reaches out. And he's lying on the hard shoulder on his back, and he hears the word, just one word, the name Jesus out loud. No context. So that's like a great alpha invitation, It's like, And so he turns up at church searching, and begins this journey. He's doing great now. He's become a Christian. We baptized him 10 days ago, and he stood up on stage, gave his testimony. He was like, I was raised from death to life. Jesus came and rescued me. I experienced, I hadn't heard about Jesus and experienced, and it's like, that's a gospel that's playing out on its own. What we've got to be doing is ready. We've got to be ready, you know. And of course, you don't just have to be kind of like, it doesn't have to be supernatural and weird. You can work your way through gently growing up or reading the Gospels or whatever. But there's definitely a quickening happening that I'm noticing. The question for us is, are we ready to respond to that as the church is? And again, the great gift is that we don't need programs, we don't need power. We just need to be present to people as God is present to us.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
really
so
good.
So good.
Yeah.
Well, I'll revisit the little
You were trying to
segue
ask
that
a
I was.
question.
Yeah, and that's
sorry,
fine.
we derailed.
No. This
Mark
is,
and I
this
got
is what
like
it's all
excited.
about.
We're like,
No, I love it. So creativity and renewal. It's your bread and butter.
go on.
Well, I guess I was going to also follow up, like in a sense that, you know, Renaissance movement is all around creativity, and in a sense you were doing that before the outpouring.
Yeah.
But then as God's given this heart for outpouring, how are those things playing off?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, long story short, we were like, maybe we were doing the wrong thing here. I mean, I feel very convicted that creativity is really important. But I was like, man, is this just like a side project? The main thing, like if revival were to come today, like we just drop everything. And the Lord was really clear with me. There's a verse where it talks about Jesus coming down the Mount of Transfiguration, little tiny verse. When all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and they ran to greet him. And that for me is what the culture is longing for, is that they'd meet Jesus and the church would encounter the Jesus of the Transfiguration, like awe and wonder, walk with him down the mountain into the culture. And what happens is the culture is overwhelmed with wonder when they see Jesus. And that wonder, that you talked about, the disenchantment, the gospel is something that re-enchants the imagination. In fact, C.S. Lewis would talk about the baptism of his imagination that led to Narnia, the encounters he had with Jesus that helped he talked about my imagination became baptized. They recently did this study, and again, neurology helps us understand more about the workings of the brain. Now we can scan and watch how the brain works. We're learning a ton of fun stuff about how our brains work. And what they find is there's one part of the brain that particularly lights up when you're imagining and you're creating. Creative thought, it's in the prefrontal cortex. This particular part of the brain that goes wild when you're dreaming, imagining, and creating. And it's a uniquely wonderful, you can observe it, it's observable science. There's another part of the brain that goes completely mad and lights up and is wild when you're praying or experiencing a spiritual activity. What was alarming to scientists is there's lots of bits of the brain, but this part of the brain that prays and the bit that creates is exactly the same bit. So there's an overlap there, which tells us about the nature of the people of God are made in the image of a God who is a creator. When we are creating, we're actually very close to the kind of heartbeat of what God does. He creates, he recreates decreation and all of that. So when we are imagining and we're making the world and we're thinking and we're educating and we're encouraging, we're fixing vaccines, we're doing the things that are going to make the world better, using our God-given imagination and creativity, that is in itself a spiritual act. So we feel really convicted that in the age of the algorithm, that the future of the human race has to be one where the church helps humanity recover its creativity. We are in incredibly uncharted waters, as you know. We're going for one of the great shifts, probably the greatest shift in human history with the rise of artificial learning and AI. And that will rewire what it is to be human. And it's essential in this moment that the church recovers the creative muscle, the understanding of what it is to be made in the image of a creator. And I don't mean, hey, let's make church more creative. What I mean is let's make Christians, everyone is creative. Let's make Christians able to go into the world and imagine and dream of what the future might look like in the image of God.
I mean, the word Renaissance, I think in the Old French, is very similar to revival. Where has this happened before in the past and that you've seen?
We were talking about this earlier. So there is a strong parallel. When there is a great technological revolution, there is always, follows that, two things. Number one, religious awakening and reformation. And number two, a cultural renaissance. They go hand in hand. And you can study this wherever you look around the world. Take, for example, probably the greatest technological change that the human race has ever experienced, probably since the wheel or agriculture, the printing press. When the printing press was invented, it transformed our ability to learn and understand concepts, and knowledge began to become accessible and democratized. And In fact, the internet is the last ripple of that great revolution. We're still playing it out today. Instantly following you mentioned the printing press, you have the Reformation. You also have Renaissance happening and being spread through the availability of information that leads to, when you put those two together, the Age of Enlightenment and the birth of the modern Western world. So the printing press has a huge impact, and it leads to an age of outpouring, of revival, the church coming alive, and the missions movement, everything we're experiencing to this day, 500 years later. Today, we're experiencing a significantly powerful shift with the age of information, the rise of AI, the computer age, and the age of automated learning, that is probably as profound, if not more profound, than the printing press. Alongside that, we should expect to see renewal take place spiritually and Renaissance happen in the culture. The difference now is when Gutenberg invented the printing press, he intended it to be a tool for illuminating the consciousness of humanity to the glory of God. What is writing the algorithm right now has no sense of the glory of God. So our job in this moment as a church is quite urgent. We've got to be involved in those conversations so that we can point people towards the spiritual renewal that I believe is beginning to happen, and help them understand that cultural renewal will follow and Renaissance will follow if the church is present in that space. If we're not, then the world will descend into a much different place. So that's why we kind of believe that the church has a role to play in this, and we want to learn, we want to get together with other Christians. That's what Renaissance is kind of about, is encouraging that conversation. How can we be filled with the Spirit of God and be revived ourselves so that we can help imagine and create? Because ultimately the algorithm is going to be life-changing for everybody, but it's not the thing. The thing is what is writing that code, what you program, and only God does original thought. So the church has the USP right now, is that we make the code that creates the universe. We understand the one who programmed everything, who made it all. So we've got the world is crying out for your voice right now. Whether you're in a small town or in a position of leadership or influence, you have the secret sauce right now that's going to help shape the future of the world.
In a sense too, two things, I guess, on it. One thing with AI is that, in a sense, it can only work from the sort of map of human knowledge we already have so far. So there's an element that AI replicates, in that sense, as a sort of an agglomeration of things. So I think, one of the things that may happen, it may seem like that ChatGPT can write that talk really quickly, but all it's doing is scouring the internet for a bunch of talks already written.
Right.
So I think you're right. It seems like creativity is at everyone's fingertips. I saw recently a friend show me some software where he took some photos that he had from, sort of 10 years ago, and then put them into this video thing, and they came alive. I mean, it was shocking to see that he could just create this video very quickly. But I think you're right, that something that's going to be really missing is totally original thought.
Yeah.
Because all AI can do is take all the thoughts that have already happened so far versus sort of original thought. So superintelligence hasn't sort of happened yet. But what we're seeing is, just a whole bunch of sort of, in a sense, like Instagram has, I heard someone recently talk about how Instagram had made all of the coffee shops in the world look the same. There's white tiles, there's a succulent, very similar coffee, because everyone just copies what everyone else is doing. So in a sense, that's been happening already. AI is only going to, accelerate that. So I think that's a fantastic point about the, originality of thought will cut through. So in a sense, the church, by not looking at the culture and trying to copy the culture, which we've often done, but actually almost, in a sense, going back to the source of a creative God, is the font of all creativity, will give us a cut through in the next age. The second thing I was going to say too is on just bringing those two conversations together, the return to weird stuff and the turn to God. It was interesting being in San Francisco the other week, just talking to people who are working in Silicon Valley. There's been a real shift in Silicon Valley towards spiritual issues. This is what all the top execs are talking about. There is this sort of move towards God. Is it all Christian? No. But it's interesting too, the comment you say that sort of like, it's not like Gutenberg, but there is increasingly a spirituality around technology that's emerging, which is again to something we've got to get our heads around.
Yeah.
So I think these sort of issues going forward are going to be really, really, really key.
I think also something that we may have touched on in previous episodes when we're talking about the newness and what the Spirit births in the church, what it looks like for a church here in Melbourne might be vastly different to what it looks like for a church in, regional New Zealand or, in London, for example. So there's something that's that we kind of slip into in copying one another as churches and comparing with one another, rather than, as you were saying earlier, encouraging and uniting and championing what God is doing in the communities that we interact with. Yeah,
it's great.
The context is another cut through, is really what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, are there any more thoughts that we'd like to go through? We're heading up on an hour here.
Oh, I think we've given many wonderful thoughts.
And
Al has been a fount of
it's
great
been
ideas.
so much fun. I'm just longing for a pastry. I've been promised
You'll
pastries.
get one. Daniel's eaten. Oh, he's left some. That's
Daniel?
good.
I got some spares. Yeah.
Are you sure?
Stephen can deliver you one on stage if you like.
Yes,
No, please.
No, but there's one with your name on it. Any thoughts from you, Daniel, as we wrap up?
Can I throw a question? Is it too late in the night to throw a question?
Do it.
I'm just interested. One common thing I'm noticing at the moment is just the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and I think that's something a real gift the church has to offer of community again. But I'm interested. Are you seeing anything, noticing anything around that kind of intersection of community and creativity versus just the kind of individual pursuit of something creative?
I think that there is a tremendous opening for creative solutions about the loneliness epidemic in the world. So I don't think necessarily people have cracked it, but it is going to become if it's not already, one of the biggest policy issues for governments going forward. I know many governments, the South Korean government's got a whole task force on it. It is a huge crisis coming. And that outplays in everything from demography and birth rates, which affect the viability of nations going forward, and also the individual thing that people are feeling. And I think that one of the reasons to be, you do see a sort of cycle. You can look in the 1930s, there was a sense of atomization, which then people turned to mass movements. So often where atomization goes, it doesn't go to more and more atomization. It goes to people looking for meaning, often in mass movements, which can be quite dangerous. And that's what you saw in the 1930s. So I think, this call for creativity is not just about, hey, we need just even a more amazing church graphics. I think it's actually about Christians being equipped by the Holy Spirit to face some of these tremendous social issues that we're facing going forward. And there's also something creative, like interesting. Someone made the comment the other day, like, Oasis are just reformed and, Coldplay are doing stadium gigs, but there's very few bands today. And it became real easy just to create music on an iPad. And there was something collaborative in the creative process. And I think there's almost something where we've lost the art of creating together, and that requires resilience and social skills. So I wonder if there's a space there for the church to teach people to connect again. I think there's Alpha. Imagine if there was just like a kind of Alpha course, which was just like how to connect with humans. And that sounds slightly facetious. I don't mean it to be facetious. I mean, I think that you do that in a big city like a London or Melbourne, people I think would turn up. So I think there's some open grass there for new games to be played on.
Yeah.
It's a weird metaphor.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor.
I like it.
I love it.
Yeah. Well, Al, thank you so much
for
being with us. We so value your presence here, your encouragement, your wisdom. Thank you. Thank you for sharing it with us.
The opposite. I feel like I sometimes struggle with imposter syndrome. Tonight, I feel like I've got full-blown hospitalization of imposter syndrome. So I'm really grateful for your kindness and for your welcome. And for all of you who've come tonight and traveled, beautiful people from all across Australia. Thank you so much, guys. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. If you want to find out anything more about the Renaissance movement, you can head to renaissancemovement.org. And if you need to find anything more about Rebuilders, you can head to rebuilders.co. But we'll catch you in another episode and we'll be back in the studio. Thank you for joining us.